This is regenerating health. I'm sure I don't need to explain it, but for those unfamiliar, in this setting, whenever the player gets damaged, they regenerate back to full health if they avoid taking further damage for a few seconds. The aim of this is to have one person victorious in a firefight and then carry on as though nothing had happened. The objective of this design is to keep the focus on the shooting, though this does make for a lot of shooting, hiding, healing, and then shooting again. Let's dub this term auto-regen for the rest of this video. Now, auto-regen is a strange design trend that has saturated shooters for the better part of the past couple of decades. That's a long time for a mechanic to be so heavily used within one genre. I'm not wanting to rag on these games that use it too much because I get why. Many fast-paced shooters need to keep the momentum going and more focus on developing other mechanics like mobility and the shooting. And the design does work at the end of the day. Regardless, the lack of innovation is still surprising to me, given health is such a fundamental component of the genre. Yet, the most common use of health in this genre seems to be the lack of it altogether. Why is this genre seemingly receded in this point in design? Aspects like combat and mobility often see different unique innovations, but health, one of the most fundamental aspects to shooters, has been rather stagnant. Yes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but if it ain't great, why keep it? Personally, when I pick up a new game, I want new ideas and something that defines a game's identity, opposed to just rehashed and repackaged ideas that I've experienced a dozen times before. There's surely more potential as to what this genre can do with this piece of design, and most other titles aren't quite complex or innovative enough with their other aspects to warrant such a stagnant use of this trope. Being as old and as crucial to video games as health is, we've seen plenty of unique takes on how health functions or how it's communicated outside of shooters. For example, in Resident Evil 2, you can clearly judge how much health your character has based on their stance, and that will directly impact your maneuverability. Or in Monster Hunter, you can clearly judge how beat up a creature is by the state of its hide, which will cause it to turn and flee at times. In games like these, health is a direct input on other parts of the game, and there's no need for an obvious health bar on screen because there's enough visual communication as is. These kinds of innovations are nice because they add more to the experience that the game is trying to convey, be it a gritty, realistic horror game or hunting a giant mythical monster. These examples are barely scratching the surface, as there's so many ways to communicate and integrate the mechanic of health into games, since this design is as old as video games altogether. With such potential for how health can be utilized, why have FPS titles been so stumped with this piece of design? We do see innovation, don't get me wrong, some developers have only just begun to deviate ever so slightly away from this trope in design, but it's still extremely incremental for the most part, and is still typically at its core auto-regen. It works, that's undeniable, but I feel there's plenty of potential for more distinct functions in shooters that's just not being tapped into as much as it should be. So what can a developer do to change up how they incorporate health? Well, it relates to how you view the mechanic itself and level of input it has into the rest of the gameplay. There are some great examples of health communication, as mentioned before, but I want to focus on the level of input specifically. Here's a spectrum that defines how health is used in different types of shooters. This is called the input spectrum. This model works if you ask the following question: how much input is directly related to the level of health the player has? Right at the end of passive, no real engagement is required to maintain the player's health. For example, auto-regen, as we mentioned before, would fit at this end, as they regenerate health automatically, as long as they're not being hit by enemies. On the other end, interactive health mechanics involve direct player input. This can be as simple as picking up a health pack, an ally healing you, and etc. The key here is that the player, or their teammate, needs to enact some action to gain, restore, or maintain their health. It's important to note that a more interactive approach isn't necessarily better than a passive one in nature, but rather depends upon the context of the game. But it's definitely something a developer should consider. A game with extremely passive health and a lack of other interesting or novel mechanics may be at a detriment, but a game that features an abundance of complexities that the player has to learn with novel and highly interactive health systems may be a bit overwhelming and may distract from the focus. It all depends on the context. So let's look at some different examples of different health mechanics and shooters and where they might fit on the spectrum. Titanfall 2 is a game all about giant mechs and pilots that fly through the sky at impossible speeds. It's a game that also features a traditional auto-regen system, which is a passive approach. This is a game I've talked about before, praising its highly complex and rewarding movement and mobility. With such in-depth, complex gameplay, it doesn't actually benefit from having more mechanics piled on top of this. As simple as this design is, it does have a purpose and a focus, which is fast-paced combat. This is a good example of an intentionally passive health mechanic, as making this part of the game highly involved would add an unnecessary barrier and take the spotlight away from aspects that require your full attention. But to be perfectly frank, not all FPS games are quite as complex as Titanfall 2. Anyway, on to our next example. Counter-Strike Global Offense is a grounded, realistic tactical shooter. In CSGO, your health is a finite resource, and unlike many other shooters, there's no way to increase it during a round. This affects the whole context of the game and your decision making. If you have low health, particular weapons pose a much larger threat than they normally do. In CSGO, you have two separate health bars, one for your character's life and another for your armor, which you can purchase at the beginning of a round. However, simplifying it down to that level does the game a bit of a disservice, as armor consumes currency which can be used for purchasing weapons and items. This is an interesting example as it falls closer to the passive side, but still features some interaction. While you have no input on your health during a round, before each round you can decide whether to buy a full kit of armor, a portion of a kit, or to save money for a later round. It's simple, but effective, as the main experience CSGO is trying to sell is realism in a slow-paced game. Halo has been an iconic FPS series for most of the past 2 decades. Pretty much all the games in the series feature auto-regen, but where they fall on the spectrum changes depending on the title. For this video, I want to talk about Halo Reach, which falls right down the middle. This game features 2 mechanics, health and shields. Shields are essentially auto-regen, but when they are depleted, the player loses health. Shields regenerate on their own, but health can only be regenerated using health packs throughout the level, which are a limited resource. This is unique because it takes the existing design of auto-regen and implements some cool and interactive ideas. It's a nice blend of the 2 ends of the spectrum. It's possible to be on low health but still have maximum shields, and vice versa. Certain game modes also change up how these 2 work. For example, there's a difficulty setting where shields only regenerate when you melee an enemy. Because there are new ideas, this gives developers room to play around and implement these interesting mechanics. This change also makes a lot of sense contextually, as Spartans in Halo Reach are meant to be less powerful and closer to human soldiers. So, having a limited pool of health adds to this idea and communicates a grittier experience. Valorant takes a lot of elements from other games on the spectrum and combines them into one. This game is extremely similar to CSGO, but with a larger focus on distinguished characters with unique abilities. With a similar armor system to CSGO, along with many other mechanics, you've got a game that has a decent bit of interaction with its health. Some agents can heal themselves in a variety of ways, be it Phoenix's fire or Reyna's lifesteal, and some, as of right now, like Sage, can heal and revive other characters. Though, these abilities are limited to particular characters, meaning if you want to regain health, you'll have to factor that in when choosing who to play, and when composing a team. It's a trade-off, which puts health regeneration up against other mechanics, which is an interesting idea. Healing is interactive with how you play and use your resources, as well as how you choose your team. Overwatch is built around its health mechanics just as much as it's built around the different heroes and team composition. There are so many levels of input that I can't cover them all here, so I'll try to summarize. Right out of the gate, there are 3 different roles to play, which interact with health in different ways. DPS, who do a majority of the damage, tanks who absorb damage and make space, and supports who provide buffs and healing. Games work as an ongoing relationship between levels of health. This is less one interactive health mechanic and rather an entire complex system of different health mechanics. Some characters regenerate health on their own, some can prevent healing, some can prevent dying, some heal their team when they attack, and the list goes on and on and on. Overwatch is very much a team-based game, and the health is extremely well integrated into this factor, as your health and ability to remain alive is influenced by your entire team's input, opposed to just your own. Health is a fundamental part of video games, and there's a lot that can be done to make it interesting. It's pretty much as old as the inception of video games themselves, and because of that, we've seen some pretty unique ideas brought to the table, and that goes beyond shooters as well. But a lot of developers lack any real desire to play around with it. These are just some of many examples of what's possible, and how more passive or interactive health mechanics can look like when they're done well. What's important though, is how these bits of design interact with other parts of the game, such as shooting, mobility, or other mechanics. These things play a role into a cohesive experience that should be well integrated. CSGO's armor plays a role into the in-game economy and affects which guns you choose and which strategies you take. Characters like Reaper and Overwatch get health back depending on how much damage they do, which ties into their central function and rewards your proficiency in combat. Integration is crucial, as health is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. It's likely the large success of this genre has caused a lot of mainstream titles to really lack innovative ideas with this mechanic, as it's fallen into a bit of a rut over the past few decades. But as we've seen with some of the games shown here, there's plenty of new ideas being brought to the genre with modern shooters, and even from battle royales. So it's possible we're approaching the end of this trend. I certainly hope so at least. Regardless, this video gives you some ideas on how shooters feature innovative approaches to health, and how developers can make it a key staple instead of a cliche piece of design. I'm PrimeHylian, and thanks for watching.